I rise to speak to New Claw's Review Forest Risk Commodities, which is in my name and the names of Lord Davies, who spoke. Thank him for his support, Baroness Boycott and Lord McNichol. And I appreciated the words also of Baroness Bakewell earlier when she spoke, and strongly agreed with the case she made for prioritising indigenous people. There is no cheaper or more effective solution if we're interested in protecting nature than backing those who've been doing so for generations, and the maths, the facts absolutely speak for themselves. 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is in land looked after, in some cases owned by indigenous people. So she makes the point very well. Deforestation is a major environmental crisis, and for just so many reasons. We heard earlier from Baroness Bakewell about the displacement of people all over the world. It's causing runaway biodiversity collapse, a loss of a terrifying variety of life forms, and once gone, they're never going to come back. Nearly 90% of deforestation is caused by agricultural expansion, and the resulting loss of habitat has caused a really horrifying decline in everything from tigers and elephants to rhino, hornbills and orangutans. Orangutans, incidentally, relevant to this amendment because they tend to live in areas where palm oil is so prevalent. And they've lost around 80% of their habitat in just the last 20 years. And forest loss goes far beyond even that. The Congo, which is disappearing at a rate of around 1 million hectares every single year, it produces most of the rainfall for the entire continent of Africa. So if those trends are allowed to continue, we're going to see humanitarian crisis on really biblical scales. And the Amazon too, we don't fully understand the role of the Amazon in generating rainfall, but we know that it generates rainfall, and we know that that rainfall falls in the southern states of the United States. And without the Amazon, there would be huge repercussions across that entire region. So there too, it is in everyone's interest that stopping deforestation remains a top priority. And I haven't even mentioned at this point climate change. Deforestation is now the second leading cause of climate change after burning fossil fuels. And in fact, there is no credible solution to climate change. There's no credible net zero plan that does not include nature at its very heart. I mean, a plan that doesn't include nature is not, in real terms, a plan at all. So it's for these reasons that I'm bringing this amendment to the House today. Noble Lords have previously expressed concern that once ratified, the CPTPP agreement will remove all tariffs on palm oil, irrespective of its environmental credentials. No right to have flagged this issue. It's been flagged a number of times. Because in pursuing that policy, we risk, at the very least, undermining the core of our COP26 messaging on the importance of forests. It also contradicts commitments made by the government under Schedule 17 of the Environment Act to tackle illegal deforestation in our supply chains. And indeed, without the safeguards of the due diligence secondary legislation in place, that safeguard is not there yet, and I hope the Minister will be able to provide some reassurance about when that is going to happen. But without that safeguard, or those safeguards, it's simply irresponsible to pursue a policy of this sort. And Noble Lords, around 90% of the world's palm oil is grown in Malaysia and Indonesia, and it's estimated that around 1% of Malaysian palm oil small holdings are certified by the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, and that 1% makes up around 40% of all the palm oil plantations in Malaysia. And the RSPO, that's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, is probably the most widely recognized certification scheme. It's voluntary, and among other things, it requires that palm oil is deforestation-free. And we know what's possible when a government is serious about this issue. We've actually seen amazing efforts and results in Indonesia. It gets very, very little credit for the work that we've seen, in fact, over the last few years. But under the leadership of a number of very impressive people, not least Minister Siti Nurbaya, that country has come pretty close. It hasn't done it yet, but it's become pretty close to breaking the link between palm oil production and environmental destruction. And I think they should get more credit for the work they're doing, because it's a model that other commodity-producing countries, I think, could learn from. Now, I want to acknowledge and welcome very briefly the side agreement that the UK and Malaysian governments have signed. It commits to strengthening efforts to conserve forests and promote sustainable supply chains, in particular around this issue of palm oils. The statement, in many respects, actually goes further than the due diligence secondary legislation, which I mentioned earlier. But the agreement still relies on the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification Scheme as opposed to the RSPO, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the details around the Malaysian scheme are unclear, and in truth, it's significantly less robust than the RSPO, and I don't think anyone argues that. And that's why it's so vital that work is done to review the impact of that agreement once it's in place. And this proposed new clause is very simple. That's what it seeks to do. It will require a review every 2 years that will assess the effectiveness of that agreement alongside the impact of the CPTPP trade deal on sustainable production of forest risk commodities more broadly, including palm oil, of course, but right the way through our supply chains. And the review would also look at the impact of the deal on deforestation within CPTPP nations and the compatibility of the deal with our own due diligence regulations. So I hope Noble Lords agree that it's a reasonable amendment. It offers a practical way of reaffirming the government's commitment to making sure our own supply chains are part of the solution and not part of the problem, as well as empowering Parliament to hold government to account on this issue. And the new clause is supported by a number of significant environmental organisations, WWF, Chester Zoo and others. It has support from the Peers for the Planet, for which I'm very grateful. And just very, very briefly, as I finish, in my previous capacity as Minister for State, I went to Chester Zoo and I saw their pioneering work on sustainable palm oil, clearing up their own supply chains, but then helping businesses in the area do exactly the same. And I want to thank them on the record for their leadership on this issue and for their work more broadly. Their Kina Batang Orangutan Conservation Project, which has been running now for a quarter of a century, involves creating magnificent nature corridors, linking up those little habitats and making it possible for distinct and previously quite cut-off orangutan populations to meet and breed and strengthen that population. My Lords, we need to ensure the environmental safeguards we put in place, like this agreement, the UK-Malaysia agreement, are effective. That's the purpose behind this amendment. A stronger, a better, and easier policy, of course, would be to remove tariffs entirely on commodities from countries that have broken the link between agricultural commodities and deforestation or conversion of important ecosystems. We know that's possible. Gabon has broken the link between logging and deforestation. Costa Rica has broken the link between agricultural commodities and deforestation. And Indonesia, I mentioned earlier. And I was thrilled to see that in the free trade agreement between the EFTA and Indonesia, there is a commitment that palm and other vegetable oils, and I'm going to quote from them, that have been produced protecting primary forests, peatlands and related ecosystems will get preferential market access. So it is possible to build these safeguards into the primary agreement, but in their absence, we have to act now by passing something similar that leads to this amendment. And I hope that when he responds, the Minister is able to provide some real meaningful reassurances that that the impact of these agreements on deforestation, on our supply chain, on our role as consumers in deforestation is properly understood and monitored, and that we are indeed part of the solution, not the problem.
My Lords, I will come.